Geography and Environmental Systems in 2008, and the CAHSS Dean's Office in 2021, but he has been hugging trees as long as he can remember. He graduated with a BA in 1992 in English and Ecology from Emory University, an MS in 1996 in Terrestrial Ecology from the University of Michigan, and a PhD in 2002 in Aquatic Ecology from the University of Michigan. Dr. Baker's experience includes basic and applied research in applied ecology, quantitative analysis, hydrology, as well as geographic information systems and remote sensing. He serves as associate editor of the journal Freshwater Science and has held appointments as a research associate at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center, as a research professor for the U.S. Geological Survey, and as a Maryland Fellow at the National Center for Socio-Ecological Synthesis. At UMBC, he has taught courses in physical geography, watershed science and management, watershed analysis, modeling, forest ecology, riparian ecology, and graduate research methods. So welcome, Dr. Baker.
Thanks for that introduction, Zach. So today I'd like to start by acknowledging my co-authors who have been working on this project and our efforts to map forests in Baltimore for many years. I'd also like to acknowledge the U.S. Forest Service and UMBC, as well as the Baltimore Ecosystem Study, for providing funding for some of this work. My co-authors are Michelle Katoski, who is a graduate student in this department, Nancy Santi, who is a research forester for the U.S. Forest Service, and Katie Lauder, who is the executive director of Baltimore Green Space here in Baltimore. So I'm going to start by making 4 assertions. These assertions are things that you may find to be common sense. I certainly did. And yet I found myself over the last 10 or 15 years trying to argue them again and again and again, especially when talking to policymakers and managers, and wondering why my arguments were falling on, seemed to me, deaf ears. So they include tree canopy does not equal forest. Urban forests can be mapped and distinguished by distinguishing edges from interiors, and that urban forests have distinct composition and structure from other forms of urban canopy. And finally, urban forests likely provide distinct and different ecosystem services from other forms of canopy within urban environments. Part of the reason I think these assertions are important is because over the last 15 years, there's been a lot of focus on urban canopy in particular, and there's been, I think, a presumption that the benefits that people understand to be associated with forests in rural areas transfer to urban environments. And so as I started to make mild objections to that, of course, that's not entirely true over the years, it's been increasingly apparent to me that I actually need to show this as opposed to just say it to convince people. And so that's sort of what led me to this work. So I asked this of you, is there a forest in this image? Or is it just trees? That's the question that hooked me back in 2008 when I joined the department and at first came to Baltimore. I was approached by Baltimore Green Space, who was concerned about the vulnerability of green spaces in the city under a relatively new city policy. Several of these canopy areas here are named, and you can see that I've labeled differently. We take a look at, yeah.
You have to share your slides.
I have to share my screen. Oh, okay. All right. How do I do that?
Yeah. Just press escape.
I think I'm sharing. Are I not?
Yes. You're sharing your meeting window. Yeah. Stop. Yeah, and go to.
You do it.
Is that?
How about we just share and then
Oh,
choose a different option?
Yeah.
You can do the whole screen, right?
You can.
Good. or maybe
The-
screen 2. That's screen 2, that one. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, it looks good.
Can't. Am I sharing?
You're good. You're good. Sorry.
Okay. All right. So I'm on that slide here, but on this, I'm doing something else, and I'm not sure why. All right, it's not really critical, but I'm not sure if I can advance my slides. That's the problem.
If you're in presentation.
Well, I guess I am.
Yeah.
All right, well, we'll just leave it, and I'll work off this slide here. Okay, so in the image you see here, this is a leaf-off image of the same site, and you can see that the red areas sort of are highlighting some structures that may be obscured under canopy. You can also see that the canopy strips now that was trees covering alleys or even lawns. And so that's what we affectionately refer to in Baltimore as broccoli, right? So it's a little bit different than what might be occurring elsewhere in Springfield Woods or Wilson Woods. And actually, in this case, Wilson Woods, it's what's known as a paper street. You can see at the bottom of the image, I don't even know if I can do this. Okay, I can. Okay. So this is a street that was originally planned for development all the way up here to Cold Spring Lane, but then these parcels were never developed, and so it revegetated and trees grew back. And the policy that the city had initiated was that if one owned land adjacent to those vacant lots, you could buy the vacant lot and do whatever you wanted with it as long as you took over tax liability. So fast forward to 2018, you can see that in the red box, that neighbor had done just that. He had bought a parcel, divided Wilson Woods in half, in doing so cleared it, and paved over Paradise and put up a parking lot or a lawn or whatever you want to call it. So in this case, this was sort of a driver of a need to map forested areas, not just canopy, across the city, and it's something that became an area of interest for me and my co-authors. So the first thing we had to answer for ourselves anyway was just what was an urban forest. We think of it as a combination of trees, and particularly not just a few trees together, but interacting canopies, canopies that interact with soils associated with it, an understory, and animals. That ecosystem includes the process of litter accumulation on the forest floor, natural reproduction, as well as decomposition. So I have a diagram of some ecosystem processes, but I also have an illustration of some decomposers, a relatively natural soil profile, and a forest patch. Instead, what had happened was, since about 2009, with the advent of very high resolution remotely generated images, folks had been delineating urban tree canopy, or UTC. This particular image is derived from aerial imagery. It has a 2-foot pixel resolution, and it's from that they can find green things, and then they combine that with LiDAR to identify green things over a certain height to identify a canopy. And it's that combination that was mapped for Baltimore and a number of other urban areas at very high resolution. And it was, people started calling this the urban forest. In fact, that moniker was ascribed earlier when folks were doing a lot of remote sensing using coarser pixel resolutions, 500 meters or even 30 meters. And at that resolution, anything that's green and tall probably is a forest. But once we started to get this high resolution map, that distinction wasn't so clear anymore. In this case, we're capturing a mix of woodlands, individual tree crowns, and canopies. In our initial versions, the tree canopies were mapped over streets and buildings. So in our mapping process, we first needed to remove those streets and buildings to understand the portions of the canopy that were not over impervious surface or hard surfaces of some kind. And so this we called soft canopy. So essentially you can see the light green areas in this map. Those are the streets, structures, parking lots, sidewalks And we distinguished soft canopy from hard canopy. We're really creative with name generation, you can tell. But the idea is that soft canopy better delineates areas where trees are rooted and not just where their branches overhang. And so it's an idea. The idea is to isolate those places where there's greater potential for natural processes. Did I want to say anything about that? Oh, not really yet. Oh, well, I guess I wanted to say that nowadays, in more recent versions of land cover, this was an early version, those classes of canopy are delineated for us because the Chesapeake Bay program, in its infinite wisdom, has sought fit to distinguish urban tree canopy over impervious cover from other forms of canopy. The next step in mapping for us was to use software called Morphologic Spatial Pattern Analysis, or MSPA. Morphometric spatial pattern, both are commonly used. This takes a binary input, in this case, canopy and no canopy, and using a single parameter, the edge width, it distinguishes 7 different types of objects or segments of canopy. And they are the interior area in green, the core, surrounding edges in black, interior edges that in blue, those are perforations, loops where a particular core is connected by some edge canopy in 2 different places, that's in yellow, a bridge where 2 separate cores are connected in red, and a branch where you have literally a branch of canopy sticking out into the matrix. In addition to that, there are islets, they're in brown, and those are isolated canopy that is too small to have any core. So those are the inherently unconnected or components of the canopy, and it's important to recognize that core represents something fundamentally different from all the others because it is wide enough to have interior spaces. The problem we faced was how to determine what edge to use. And so now I'm going to detour for a little while in my explanation and talk to you about how we came up with that number. I initially thought, well, there's been a lot of forest sampling in the city of Baltimore by the Forest Service and others, and we can just use that data to determine what the appropriate edge width is. But it turns out in forest patches all across the city, the sampling that had been done using plot-based sampling, like you see here, rectangular plots, circular plots, and they don't do a good job distinguishing edge from interior. In fact, of the 200 forest samples within the iTree sample data set, only 30 were in what I might consider forest, and most of them weren't anywhere close to an edge. So with my colleagues at the Forest Service and Baltimore Green Space, we developed a new kind of sampling that uses distributed sampling using glass prisms to sample the relative dominance of overstory. We also sampled the understory distributed across patches, not the understory, the ground cover at each one of these yellow points, and also assessed the degree to which vines were taking over the canopy and measured a number of abiotic characteristics as well. So this is the Schumacher scores, our vine invasion index. The cartoon here was drawn by Niels Schumacher, our first intern. And you can see that, well, maybe you can't see. I'll try to illustrate. This is a 1 where there's a little bit of vines on the stem. 2, the vines have gotten up to the lower part of the canopy. 3, they've made their way into the canopy. This is probably a 3, maybe a 3.5. 4, they've taken over about half of the canopy, and 5, they're covering the entire thing. And since it's possible for ivy to get onto and other vines to get onto the canopy from neighboring trees, we have some other classes, but you get the idea. So here are some of those samples distributed across the city with a terrain underneath. So you can see we're sampling different kinds of canopy. And over time, we've collected about, we've sampled about 47 different patches, and that's resulted in just under actually 900 sample points throughout the city. And we've endeavored over time to collect samples in a spatially balanced way, proportionate to different regions of the city. One of the things we've learned from that sampling is that our forest patches are overwhelmingly native in their canopy. So this graph on the left shows the proportion of native species in our samples, and just the density of that. It's a probability density plot. And so what it's showing is that the vast majority of our plots are almost entirely native, with only a small number that have some proportion less than 100%. And these are species codes for the 10 most dominant trees in our sample. And they are the yellow poplar, Lie-2, the white oak, Quercus alba, the red oak, red maple, beech, green ash, black cherry, black locust, black gum, and slippery elm. What's interesting about this is that that's quite different from species, the 10 most dominant species in for street trees on the left, and the Forest Service's random sampling effort across the city on the right, where the yellow species are all non-natives or exotic species. And so if you just sampled Baltimore, you get the sense that there's a lot of exotic species out there, and there are, but not necessarily in the forest patches. So because we had distributed samples, we could do an analysis of characteristics of the nativity of our forest samples across a gradient from the edge to the interior, and that's what I'm showing here. So I have in the top set of panels, we're analyzing along a gradient of distance to canopy edge, the proportion of native overstory stems, and here we have the proportion of native coverage in the ground cover. And what we're doing here is looking for a point in this blizzard of dots that creates the greatest change from one side to the other. And that's the dark red line. Because that cloud can be biased, it's just one sample, we sample our sample again and again and again 500 times to generate a band of uncertainty about what happens if we took a slightly different sample, and would it change our estimate of where that change point occurs. And that's what the pink area is. So what we're finding here is that overstory becomes more native after you get about 12 meters into the woods. The ground cover becomes more native after you get about 51 meters into the woods. And there's some uncertainty around that, and that's expressed by a confidence interval. And then these are other forms of representation of that difference, box plots and violin plots that show the actual distribution of values across those 900 points. So we did that same kind of analysis. Here's the same proportion of native stems you just saw with the stem density, so the tree density out in the forest, the diversity of different types of species and species richness, as well as a lot of other abiotic parameters and ground cover parameters. And those were all sort of elements of the structure or the composition of edge to interior gradients across Baltimore City. And we found that there were pretty distinct places where change was occurring. And in this particular graph, you can see that a number of these changes are occurring very close to about 15 to 20 meters, and then another is something much higher, closer to 50 meters. We also performed an analysis of individual species. So I got some examples here for you. Here we're doing the same kind of analysis on the distribution of Amur honeysuckle, which is an invasive shrub, I guess, small tree, and black locust, which is a native, but it's a root or a weedy species. And those are two species that tend to decline as you move from the edge to the interior. And we've done that same kind of analysis here. And then there's two species that we see associated with more interior conditions, the yellow poplar I mentioned before, and beech. We're doing the same kind of analysis here, only we're using both occurrence and abundance of the species to make that distinction. And then we're combining that across all species in a technique called threshold indicator taxa analysis. And this is designed to find patterns of change in a community of different species along a gradient. And it does that by finding robust decliners. Thanks, Ashley. Took me out of my rhythm.
You're really paying attention online, though.
Yeah, that's good. So the species on the left there, those are species that are edge affinity that are declining. The ones on in the red are increasing, and you can see that there's a really sharp. And so what this is, and because they're normalized, so we can add them together and get a pattern of change for blue and red across that gradient. And so you can see there's a lot of change going on close to the edge with blue, more change with the red farther away. and we can analyze the uncertainty about where that change occurs. That's what these density plots are showing, and that gives us a change point with a confidence band around it. We can do the same thing for ground cover. This is the pattern for ground cover. I won't dwell on this, except to say that because we can combine all of the measures of change and look at where we find the greatest agreement across all those different measures. And what we found was that that change occurs between about 15 meters and about 19 meters, and there's a secondary zone of change between 41 and 45. Okay, so there's like two bands. There's 0 to 15, there's 15 to about 41 or 2, and then there's something larger than that. So then we analyze what happens if we start looking at the species diversity in those different zones. Here we're performing an analysis called Rarefaction, which is looking at the species area, where area is represented by the number of samples. But since the order of samples you count species with can change the effects of that, we reshuffle them and do it again and again and again, and that creates kind of a thick band of uncertainty around how the different orders of samples that you're doing to count species richness affects your relationship. And so we did this for herbs, vines, shrubs, and trees, and we found that edges and interiors have really similar patterns, those deep interiors past 40 meters, but a transition zone between about 15 and 40 was the pauperate in both herbs and vines in terms of species richness. By contrast, if we looked at shrubs, the interiors host greater richness than both edges and the transitional zone, and that same thing is true for trees. So hopefully at this point I've convinced you that edges, the thing that we're mapping as edges, is distinct, and it has biodiversity consequences as well as structural consequences in urban forests in Baltimore. So now we can finally tweak that parameter of the MSPA and start mapping edges and interiors. And so this is that same landscape with the cores mapped in green and their associated edges in black. And those became our patches of forest canopy, our forest patches. Remembering that we've already described cores as fundamentally different from the edges that surround them. So the hypotheses, if you might want to call them that, about forest patches are that they have more substantial canopy. We sort of know that already, and they're probably more likely remnant forests that have not grown back, the areas with core. They have distinct structure and presumably function. I'll get to that a little bit. They're probably more resistant to exotic invasion than other edge habitats. They may have more well-developed soils and more likely to have native species. And we expect that they are going to be experiencing some form of natural reproduction more often than not. When we did this analysis, we noticed that there seemed to be two kinds of patches, really large patches and smaller patches. So there was a size distribution, and we decided to distinguish those. And we performed analysis, and anything with any core at all we called a grove. They're light blue here. But then if there was more substantial core area, so much more substantial that we could actually sample it with a plot and measure that and distinguish it, and observe something different on the inside versus the outside, we call that a forested natural area. And it turns out through some experimental work and trial and error that we came up with a minimum width of that core area of about 11 meters and a minimum area of 200 meters squared. So that turns out to be, interestingly, closely corresponding with some other definitions of forest that are used elsewhere. There is a state definition of forest that describes forest as any canopy larger than 10,000 square feet. And it turns out that our smallest groves are around that same size, a little bit bigger than that. Turns out that 10,000 square feet of canopy as mapped from the air can also capture a single tree, which I don't think a forest makes. And then also a lot of broccoli. But our groves do tend to correspond to that size. And then our forested natural areas, the minimum size is around half a hectare, which is about an acre, and maybe a little bit less, a little bit more than that. And that is both consistent with some other state definitions, a Chesapeake Bay definition of forest, and also with a UN definition. So just by happenstance, we are sort of reproducing through a different method the ways that other people have defined forest elsewhere. So we can map that across the city. Here we have forested natural areas in blue, and a lighter blue is where the groves. You can see their distribution. And that's different than the green you normally see when you look at the city from space, because you're seeing other forms of tree canopy. So just to show you that these are actually different things, here's using LiDAR to describe the canopy height of all the places we're mapping as forested natural areas and groves. And I'm using a box plot here. So the dark line in the middle is the median. The notch around that is an estimate of the variation that might lead to a statistically significant difference. The box itself is the 75th, 25th quantile, and then the whiskers are 10 to 90th, with the circles being outliers. So what this is showing here is that forested natural areas are larger areas of forest that have, surprise, bigger trees. Groves are somewhere in the middle, and then other types of canopy tend to be smaller. Here's our Schumacher vine index, where we have vine invasion. And what we're showing here is that forested natural areas, generally speaking, have less vine invasion and than other canopy, and also groves. Groves in this particular analysis appear to have more vine invasion, maybe than we would expect, but it's not significantly different from the rest of the canopy in the city. So hopefully I'm convincing you that there are some structural differences between forested natural areas and groves and other kinds of canopy, and also that they might function differently in terms of their biodiversity and their resistance to invasion. When we map patches, we can start to think about the components of patches. And this is work that Michelle did with me while she was an undergrad. So what we're doing here, if you're looking at me, 90th percentile of my height is maybe here, 70th is maybe here, 50th, debatable, but here, and then 20th is down by my knees or something like that. And what we're doing, if you can imagine that I'm a tree and there's lots of me in a room, we're mapping the height at each one of those percentiles across a forest patch. And so that's this 90 percentile value here. There's 70, there's 50, there's 20, and this is the height for all of those values across the forest patch. But wait, there's more. It gets even more complicated. We're distinguishing two different parts of the forest patch. The edge, as we've mapped it in MSPA, from the interior. So the interior core area is green, the edge is gray. And what we're showing you here is that at almost every percentile in this particular forest patch, the edge looks different than the interior in terms of the height of biomass that is at any particular percentile. We think this is actually of interest, where not only are we demonstrating that edges are different structurally from interiors, but we think that from patch to patch to patch, this can be a diagnostic tool that can be used to understand structural diversity and heterogeneity. So we can do this across canopies. Here is all of Baltimore, and you can see this pattern. The big paunch or belly-like look is telling you that the mode of that distribution, where a lot of the observations are, is actually not that high off the ground for most of the canopy in Baltimore. But when we distinguish forest patches, either groves or FNAs, we can see that generally speaking, we're identifying taller trees and greater biomass at height, and that's particularly true for the FNAs. So hopefully I'm convincing you that these are structurally different places and worth treating as such. We can also use this diagnostically. Here's on the left, you see that same plot with Springfield woods. There's also another plot here, Hep Forest in the middle, and then Still Meadow, which is right off of Frederick Road and nearby here. You'll notice if you just look at the green that Springfield Woods and Hep look very similar at first. And if you pay attention to the gray of those two plots, they have similar height distributions at different percentiles. There is, I think you can say qualitatively that the edge at Hep Woods looks more similar to the interior than it does at Springfield. And that's because it literally is interior forest or large trees right to a sidewalk. And then it's a sharp edge, as we call it, right? Whereas there's more gradual change in some newer growth around the perimeter of Springfield Woods, and that results in this distinction, a structural distinction. There's also some pattern in the undergrowth. Springfield Woods has some vine invasion, and Hep has a multiflora rose invasion going on. Stillmet, on the other hand, is a degraded canopy. It was already degraded when we sampled it with this LiDAR, but since then it's had a lot of ash die-off and now is the focus of a major US Forest Service restoration. But in this case, here's another case where the edge and the interior look similar to each other, but very distinct from places like Hepwoods and Springfield because their trees aren't that big and there's a lot of gaps in that canopy. So using LiDAR like this, we can essentially detect the difference between a degraded forest canopy, something that has hard edges from interior space to the outside, and then something that has a more gradual edge. Michelle is also furthering this work in her master's work, and I'm not going to steal her thunder, but I'm going to talk about the fact that all the stuff that I just showed you was developed using 10-meter pixels to summarize tree height across a forest patch, and that's shown sort of on the left here for this particular forest patch. This turns out to be Hepwoods, actually. For any one pixel, you get a vertical profile of LiDAR, and that's what's shown in this Skittles graph below. And what you can see here is that there's a tree there, but it's actually only half of a tree. And so when you sample LiDAR like this with a 10-meter pixel, every individual pixel can suffer from what we call a mixed pixel problem. You can get part of a tree, 2 trees, a tree in a gap, and you never know. It's like a box of chocolates. On the other hand, what Michelle has been doing is delineating or segmenting the canopy into individual trees or 2 trees together that have very similar structural properties, and then delineating them and summarizing their LiDAR attributes differently to see if that can help us better understand the structural properties of urban woodlands. And that is illustrated by the Skittle diagram below that figure on the right. I'll let her give her thesis defense in the not too distant future to describe her results. But mapping also has other features and factors. So here's a study that actually Zach participated in. Where are you, Zach? When he was an undergrad, that we've continued since then. Here we're mapping forest patches in Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York City, and comparing the distribution of forests relative to other types of canopy across those 3 large metropolitan areas. So this is work I'm engaged with Nancy Santi. You probably can't read those graphs very well, so I'll walk you through them. The first panel on the left and the bottom here, these are aerial summaries of those 3 cities. In both cases, it's New York City on the left, Philadelphia in the middle, Baltimore on the right. The right panels are proportions, the proportions of canopy that fall into those categories. In the top 2 panels, what we're looking at is all canopy, or other canopy in orange, forested natural areas in dark green, and groves in light green. We're talking about the total area, the proportional area. And what you can see from that graph, I think, is that Philadelphia and Baltimore, as a proportion of their total urban area, have a lot more forest patches and groves making up their canopy than New York City does. All right, so that we just learned something about those 3 cities just by mapping forest patches. The bottom is even more complex, because that's how we roll. It's showing ownership patterns. So the cool colors, starting with this blue in the middle and then going down from there, are various forms of public ownership. So this is municipal, then state, and then federal in, I guess, pink. And the green and up are other forms of private ownership, institutional ownership, commercial, industrial, private, residential. And so the take-home message here is that of those 3 cities, Baltimore is remarkable for a large fraction of its forest patches. These are actually forested natural areas that are privately held. Okay, yes, David?
The vertical axis on the ones on the left, what's that?
Hectares.
That's number of hectares. So
Yes.
Like New York's so much bigger.
It's a bigger land area, yeah. A much bigger land area. Philadelphia is bigger than Baltimore, yeah. Okay, thanks for asking that. In addition, we can assess that with terrain analysis, that 66% of canopy in Baltimore occurs in or near river valleys, and 81% of patches. In other words, we have a lot of forest that is associated with a river valley. So it's not representative of the upland terrain. That probably comes as a surprise to no one. Philadelphia is very similar. This is just an example of that. Here's the Gwynns Falls in the background in Google Earth, I guess, with 3D. And here's a forest patch. This looks like it would be upland in all other respects, but you can see there's a little indentation here. This is an old stream that has been buried under this neighborhood. and used to flow right through this forest patch. But because it's associated with stream and has different soil properties, different species affinities than it might be if it was a complete upland property. So that's important for thinking about what kinds of forests we have in different parts of Baltimore. We wouldn't find this analysis if we didn't identify patches first. Here's another piece of work that Nancy and Santi and I are doing along with some others from different places. It turns out there's some 100-year-old or almost 100-year-old aerial imagery of Baltimore that has been compiled and georectified by folks here at UMBC, and it is comparable with modern day imagery. And so what we're doing here is analyzing in this bottom graph of the things that were forest developed or non-forested vegetation like grasses or other open areas, what fraction of them, what fraction of the current forested natural areas were forest 100 years ago versus other forms of canopy, if that makes sense. And where does that canopy distributed now? So we're learning about the history of these places that is, again, assisted by the fact that we're delineating patches and not just canopy. So hopefully I've been able to convince you that these forested patches are areas, they have distinct characteristics, they have history with ownership, they occur in different neighborhoods. And I think this is really important for distributional equity because there's been a lot of focus over the last 10 years about sprinkling green in lots of different parts of the city. And I will grant you that planting trees is a way easier way to do that than planting forest patches, because it's very difficult to plant a forest patch. But if we think that we're going to generate the same kind of benefits for neighborhoods when we plant trees, despite the fact that it takes 50 to 75 years to generate a mature tree, this is another issue we need to wrestle with. So I think that that implies distinct ecosystem services. So to illustrate that, I want to talk about some work we've done both in Baltimore and DC. And in fact, we're currently working on doing this in about 15 to 20 cities in the United States. So on the left, we have some soft canopy. On the right, in the middle there, we have some hard canopy over buildings and streets and sidewalks. And then we have no canopy. And the question is, do these provide distinct ecosystem services? In particular, we're interested in urban heat. So this study was performed in Washington, D.C., along with my colleague and collaborator, Mike Alonso, and who's the lead author. So what we have here is a bunch of thermal measurements collected over Washington, D.C. on a hot day in the summertime. And what it's showing is the relative temperature anomaly. So relatively hot or relatively cool. And on the right, you see canopy cover in the district. So we performed some analyses to try to understand whether we could predict the temperature anomaly from land cover and some other factors, including wind and shadows and things like that. And what we found was that soft canopy cooled more than hard canopy. In other words, things that were rooted in the ground and surrounded by other trees tended to have greater cooling effects than canopy that was over pavement or other impervious surfaces. That probably does not come as a shock. That was just something we were establishing because most studies like this don't distinguish between hard and soft canopy, and we wanted to show that they were different. But then the take-home message for us thinking about forest patches is we analyzed patches relative to other kinds of canopy. And we did this in morning, in the afternoon, and the evening. And we found that in the most of the cooling occurred in the afternoon and the evening by canopy, probably no surprise there either. But when we looked at the relative impact, and that's what these graphs are showing, I want to point with my hand, but I don't want to do that. So we're looking at the effect of patches in this purple color versus other kinds of canopy in the afternoon. The patches had a substantial cooling effect. In the evening, they both did. And in the pre-dawn, they had similar effects. So there was a real difference in the afternoon effects of cooling, looking at patches versus other kinds of canopy distributed across the city. That's not to say that that kind of distributed canopy does not cool. It's just that relative to patches, the patches cooled more. And that means a lot when we're thinking about how to mitigate or what to expect in terms of mitigation of urban heat effects under climate change. So, beginning, I made 4 assertions. I want to revisit this. If you believe that seeing is believing, and you can see that I do, I hope I've convinced you that tree canopy is not forest, not the same thing, that urban forest can be mapped by thinking about edges and interiors, and that urban forests have a distinct composition from what's going on the outside, from other forms of canopy, and that they likely provide distinct ecosystem services. For many of you, this will probably not be a shock, but I felt when I was talking to folks that it needed to be shown rather than just said. And I hope that I'm starting to do that. We all of us are starting to do that over time with this information. So if I have some take-home messages, here's a map of the MSPA in Baltimore City and Baltimore County that Michelle has been working on with Maggie Holland and some other U.S. Forest Service colleagues. And you can see that there's a progression as you leave the city and go to the county underneath the URDL, the urban-rural demarcation line, and into the rural part of the county. Rural. So mapping allows distinct places to be identified, and you can link that to field data. That's really important for documenting these effects. Charlie, you're getting a message?
Oh, good.
I love this. That those distinctions imply process differences: disturbance, succession, habitat for animals. In fact, next week, the seminar is, I got to give a plug for Ohad Paris, who's going to be presenting his dissertation research in our seminar, talking about nesting habitat for cardinals throughout the city, using urban forest patches as a template and understanding forest structure and its impact on nesting success. So please attend that. This type of patch delineation also enables analysis and summary with other forms of digital data sets, and I've tried to illustrate some of those today. We found differences in canopy dimensions that we think can help as a diagnostic for understanding canopy condition and forest patch condition across the city of Baltimore. So distinguishing those segments is key in the urban tree canopy, and that allows for improved quantification of the attributes, the ownership, distributional equity, and ecosystem services. And this can, and I think should be, included in our contemplation of changes to policy, including the Forest Conservation Act in Maryland. Thanks very much. I'll take any questions.
Right, thank you, Matt. Questions in the room first. I'll ask for questions. Mine too.
Yes, sir, Mr. Lansing. Doctor.
Who are these people that aren't buying your 4 assertions that seem obvious to all of us, and why aren't they? What's the resistance to understanding it that way? That you had to actually go through and show all this stuff. So
I think that if I pinned on any ecologist, I wouldn't get any disagreement.
Yeah.
I think the issue has been that the remote sensing products are so ubiquitous and available, and they're so readily easy to use that it's just easier to suck them up as canopy and do an analysis on canopy than do a deep dive into what that canopy means. And I think that has been the pattern that I've seen. And I don't want to blame remote sensors, because I'm a remote sensor too sometimes when I wear that hat. But I think it's that when people see the maps are a powerful thing, and they inspire people to do an analysis, but they don't always inspire people to think about what they're analyzing, because it's difficult unless you have other data and have a means or an approach to get that, to make that distinction. That's my impression, and I'm trying to illustrate that it is not that hard to do this, and we can.
I guess just it seemed like early on when you were talking about a more precise way of mapping in a remote sensing way, it actually led to less accurate understanding of what's going on, because you can now map those trees that are hanging over the sidewalks and whatnot.
Yeah, so the typical term in remote sensing is resolution,
Yeah.
but the other term that's associated with that is precision.
Yeah.
And there's map precision, but there's also conceptual precision.
Yeah.
And that's true in almost all of remote sensing, and it's an application in environmental science. When you change resolution, you have to think about what that means about the things that are being mapped. Yeah. Felipe.
I was wondering if you know if there are any relations between the species that you are looking for in the Baltimore and the like side of the crown and the size of the tree. Because if there are any relations between the size of the crown and the size of the tree, you could like search in other images that don't have LiDAR data with high resolution satellite imagery to relate the size of the crow and the height to estimate in different regions as well. Do you know if this is possible?
Well, in principle, I think that there are. So the question is like, can you relate the size of the crown to the different species? I think in the forest. I think in principle that might be possible. I wouldn't say the size of the crown, like the aerial extent of the crown per se, but maybe its vertical structure. And actually, that's something that Michelle's really interested in, because you might expect that species with different tolerance of understory conditions might retain biomass at lower heights. But in practice, I think that also it's really difficult to distinguish whether the tree is retaining those things or if there's other things growing up underneath it that are producing sort of medium height returns in LiDAR. The other thing I will say is that in Baltimore in particular, but I think this is true all over Maryland, we have a mix of different types of forests that have different successional histories. And in some cases, we have trees that kind of all grew up at the same time, and they tend to have much more uniform canopy sizes regardless of species. And then there are trees that grew up in the open, and then other trees colonized around them afterwards. And so they might have very large canopies, but that may be a function of how they were established and grew as saplings and young trees rather than a particular species. So I think it's possible maybe to combine that information with other forms of remote sensing if you want to begin to get at species. And in fact, that's part of what Zach's thesis is about. So, there's certainly increasing capacity all the time, but I don't think you can do it just with LiDAR right now.
Thank you, Mr. Mika. So you said it is difficult to plant a forest patch than planting trees, and that's from your perspective on urban forests. So what's your take on other types of forests that's they're doing plantations all around the world?
I have a definite take on that, and I actually published that in 2015 in an article with some other co-authors. We argued after there was a pile-on to commit to planting trees all over the world that one needed to be very careful about the decision to plant for a lot of reasons. Some of them were natural history reasons, like that wasn't a forested area to begin with, and others have to do with the socio-cultural context in which those plantations were occurring. And then, of course, there was an ecosystem reason, which is that a plantation is not a forest, as I'm sure you're well aware. So all of those things are really important considerations. And that same conflation also occurs in global remote sensing data sets, as I know you know, but it's a problem, and it has been a problem where people interpret things that are green from Landsat data or some other broad, relatively coarse pixel size to be forest when they may not be. And that's true even after there's been some attempt at rehabilitation, because people can, if it's green on a satellite image, people can declare success and walk away, and that does not necessarily prove to be true on the ground.
I do have a couple of questions from online. So I have a question from Eric Brown. When applying these ideas to other cities, how do you distinguish the urban class? And are there differences with suburban forests and woodlands?
Well, that's an interesting question. That's, I think, what is implied by this graph right here. We didn't tackle that question in our analysis. We used the metropolitan boundary, like the inverted triangle that's on this map for Baltimore to do our analysis. So we didn't begin to tackle the philosophical question about what urban versus suburban is, because in my experience, that is at least as difficult as what is a forest. But I think it's a really interesting question. And with these mapping techniques, I think it would be a great idea to go out and try to figure that out.
Thanks. I have another from Mahmaz Mazaheri. How many types of forest are there in Maryland?
Well, the relatively natural forest types have been described by others. Grace Brush has a wonderful paper, an incredibly comprehensive paper from 1980 that sort of describes natural forest types and their associated soils across Maryland. There have been some broader regional forest types delineations by other investigators. My favorite is Lucy Braun from the 1950s. But what we see in urban areas and in places where there's been a lot of human occupation is, and our paper that when we did this survey describes this, we see some of those same forest types emerging in the city, and I presume they're remnant forest types. But then we also see things that don't match any of our described forest types. So those are novel assemblages of plants, and that's an area of active research, like what controls how those assemblages get together and grow. In our department, Dr. Swan is really interested in that question, and at Johns Hopkins, Megan Volio is really interested in that question. But we do see evidence that there are sort of novel combinations of things that you wouldn't think would normally grow together. So the answer is I can't tell you because there's too many. It depends whether you're a lumper or a splitter.
And Dawn has a question about the piece related to urban heat.
Sure.
Dawn, you want to go ahead?
I'll try. Nat, sorry I couldn't be there, but I really enjoyed this, and I feel like I'm gonna have to watch the recording like 2 times to process everything because it's a lot to think about. I was wondering if you could go back to that slide about the urban heat, because I feel like my mind didn't process it as fast as you went through it.
I didn't explain it very well, did I? Yeah, you're right. The first graph on the top left shows the distribution of cover of patches in the way that we sampled the area right around any temperature measurement. And the purple area are the patches, the gray area is other forms, the gray bars are other forms of canopy. And that's just to show you that in general, we only had estimates of about 50% canopy cover for most of the places where we had temperature measurements. And the vast majority of our estimates of patch cover were small relative to the area we were summarizing land cover in. Does that make sense? The next 3 panels show the relationship between distributed canopy. This is like, it's a more complicated equation, but we have isolated the patch effect versus the other kinds of canopy effect in the model. And they're represented by the curves. So the gray is the other kinds of canopy. We're calling it distributed canopy. And the bluish, purplish thing is patches. And so those are the effects on temperature. The anomaly is relative to the average at that time for the city. And so if you're a little bit warmer than the average temperature, you're going to be above 0 on the y-axis and on the left side of the graph. And if you're cooler, you're going to be below 0 and have a negative anomaly. So you're cooler than the average temperature. I can't believe I didn't explain that. I was sort of trying to grill myself to take a moment to explain some of my slides in greater depth. And I appreciate you bringing that question up. So what we're seeing is that when the sun is lower in the sky in the evening and all trees shade, even larger areas than their canopy normally covers because of the sun angle, both canopy, distributed canopy, and patches cool. Not exactly at the same temperature, but they're both having a very similar slope of that line, which tells you that their unit impact is about the same. In the afternoon, distributed canopy, which presumably are places that run out of water, but there's just not a lot of canopy there in any one location. Don't seem to be able to transpire at the level that produces cooling. And that's the mechanism we think is driving a lot of this. It's shade, yes, but this is early afternoon, the sun is almost right overhead. The extent of that shadow is both moving and small relative to the canopy, but the canopy is still transpiring, and that exchange of energy that occurs when water is converted to vapor sucks up a lot of heat right out of the air. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful, and I will probably watch the recording again.
Yeah, anyway.
For you, because it was a lot to take in, but it's super interesting. I'm excited to be hearing it.
Thank you.
Ellen?
Thanks. That's awesome. I really like this from like a research design perspective, thinking about taking something that we see as one thing is actually made up of many other things.
It's like a hierarchy or something.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's where
Maybe we should teach that.
I want to go with that question, right? So what you showed is that trees aren't all the same, that when they're in this forest patch configuration, is there an argument to be made if we take a look at it from a different level where forest patches together have a cumulative effect, let's say, on some way to think about the configuration where a forest patch isolated on its own does something different than 2 or 3 forest patches together. And the reason that I'm asking that is actually because of one of your first slides where you showed the edge, the core, the bridge, and I was thinking about that as a network graph.
That's what it is.
Easily would be to do that kind of analysis that were represented in something like a network.
So in terms of urban heat, there have been studies. They haven't used temperature. They've used the radiometric signature of heat to do this analysis. But there have been some studies that suggest that when it comes to urban cooling, the more forest you have, better. And that there's an advantage to having larger forest patches versus smaller forest patches. There's been some other argument that having it distributed is different than having it all in one place. That's been a little tougher to show, but that argument has been made as well. And that, I think, is an area that could really benefit from further investigation. I should say, by the way, that it turns out measuring the urban heat island is pretty challenging. A lot of that has been done using satellite detections of the thermal signal from cities, but that's not the same thing as what we experience on the ground. And even the way that we measured it in our paper was from a road with a thermometer on a car with a GPS unit and someone who's driving around, and that's biased because it's on the road, and it's not the same as if you're walking in a forest patch. And so more recent efforts have been suggested, and one of them is to use bikes and bike temperatures. And Mike Alonso, as a corollary to the study we did with roads, he actually spent part of the pandemic in the summer riding around DC every day in very hot temperatures with a mountain bike and trying to collect that kind of information. So measuring temperature is another key component. And there's some folks at Hopkins that are really trying to get to the bottom of the biases in how we measure temperature, so we have a good response variable to do this kind of analysis work. So did I just unpack that? And so it's really complex now? Yeah, okay. I guess then I win. I do think that there's a lot of potential for thinking about how we distribute forest versus trees in cities as a policy or a planning, especially in the context of redevelopment and what the likely benefits are. But I think we're still learning about what those might be. In terms of habitat, one of the things that seems to be emerging is that you might presume that connectivity is good, but in many cases, that's also a conduit for invasive species. And so it's not clear that some of the urban animals that we might be interested in creating habitat for really need that connectivity, but others might. So that's another whole set of questions that I can't answer, but I think they're really interesting. But it starts with measuring, mapping patches. Yeah.
Stu. Stu
It is
Schwartz.
Stu. Oh, Stu.
Yeah, last one.
Okay. Hi, Stu.
Oh, hi. Thanks very much. Matt, I just wanted to, as you can anticipate, draw you out a little bit on the policy implications. When you show that the dominant native species forests are associated with an invasive edge effect, I take it as policy that would tell us that if we want to try and restore native forests, we need to do more than just plant native trees, right? We have to establish a large enough core to insulate them from the invasive effect of the edge. But thinking about the way associations can get turned into policy, like impervious area, the converse, I take it, is not true. If you have patches of invasive species, it would not be sufficient to simply expand them so there's a core without edge effects and expect that to turn back into native forest. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And thank you for that question. So I think that it's not just the only solution to the edge effects is not simply to make larger forest patches on the one hand, because this is a socio-ecological system and people can manage that edge and often do in various ways. And so, but targeting that as a strategy for conserving the nativity of the woodlands in an urban area is an important strategy. And that's, I think one of the implications of this work is that I didn't show that the proportion of non-native ground cover in this talk, but it's mostly non-native. So there's invasive or exotic species throughout our woodlands anyway already, and protecting them is going to take something more than just having large forest patches. The vines mostly are on the edge, but there are plenty of examples of exotic vines that have somehow, probably through bird dispersion, got into the middle of woodlands, found canopy gaps. Because a lot of our forest patches are along streams, there are a lot of internal gaps that are accessible either by water or by bird dispersal that can lead to infections of exotic species. So, and so you're absolutely right about the second part of your statement that the converse is not true, that if you have an invaded or exotic dominated canopy, that just growing it is not going to result in native species. That's not how dispersal and source populations work. So there'd have to be some kind of active management.
No, I appreciate it. I mentioned that only because when you start talking about your policy prescriptions, I think it'd be great if you could clarify that, thinking about the burgeoning interest. You know, for example, NIFWIF from the Infrastructure Act this year had $20 million that were allocated for 4 infrastructure practices, one of which was urban reforestation. So, you know, the potential for mischief that comes from associations, I guess. But thanks. Wonderful talk. Really, really nice.
I really appreciate, as you know, listening to your sitting back and just taking a gander at RFPs and then reflecting on what they imply about the thinking that went into them. So that's always entertaining. I really appreciate that.
Thanks, man.
All right, I think we need to call it at that because we are almost 10 minutes over. But thank you very much, Matt.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone online for joining, and we will be posting this recording on the CS3 YouTube channel.